You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 6 Cryptic Visions. Mark fiddled for ages with his soldering iron. "Everything's all wired up," he said proudly. "Shall I light the blue touch paper and retire?" he joked. "Why not? I'd be most surprised if this Heath Robinson affair actually worked anyway." Now that's not a very nice thing to say after all the work we've put into it. Before them, on the dining table, stood a baffling array of boxes, gadgets, plugs, and wires, all connected up to Mark's computer, the social club's VCR, and a VDU monitor screen. Mark sent the first of the collected data through his computer program. He checked everything else was switched on and ready to go. The tape was set into motion. With bated breath, they both stared at the screen. Nothing. They looked at each other and laughed, but they didn't mean it. It was the reaction which came spontaneously after months of toil. They could just as easily have burst into tears. Mark leapt to his feet and fiddled behind the computer. "Thank God for that," he gasped, visibly shaken. "Why? What happened?" "It's all right. Don't panic, Jane." "Don't panic? It's you who panicked, remember?" she yelled accusingly. "Anyway, what was it?" "My program. I forgot to load in the transposing program," he admitted, breathless from the leap. "What now? Shouldn't it be doing something by now?" Jane was disappointed. She really thought it would work despite her earlier remark. She sighed back into the armchair, thinking of coffee. "Look!" "What?" "On the screen, look!" Jane tried to focus her eyes on the appropriate distance in all of a split second. "What is it?" "It's just squiggles," she said, wondering what all the excitement was about. "They are squiggles. It means it's working all right," explained Mark, rolling his eyes to the ceiling when Jane wasn't looking. In that stupid moment, he realized how much she really meant to him. He was sure he must love her, if only he had more time to think of her and their happiness just being together. The screen cleared a bit to reveal what could only be described as fast, flashing images. No detail could be made out at all. It was like masses of sticks and splodges moving at speed across the monitor screen. Mark stared at the wall for a few moments, sensing what was wrong or what could be wrong. He finally uttered and looked at Jane, who was lost in thought. "If you're dreaming," he said intently, "what do you see?" He was on the edge of the chair. "It's fast, isn't it?" "What you see in dreams is usually appearing to happen faster than the real world. You sort of go through a bit and then skip past a lot of it quickly, don't you?" "I never thought of it before, but yes, I think you're right." She nodded in agreement. "So, if what we're seeing on the screen is a real dream sequence, but a sort of speeded up version, then if we slow the computer program down—" "No, that wouldn't work. What we have to do is to slow up the original signal recording from the EEG amplifier. I'm sure that must work." Mark's mind was working at full tilt by now. There came a lull in activity as Mark began searching through half a dozen as yet unpacked large boxes of his electronic bits and pieces. Jane sneaked out of the room, making straight for the kettle while Mark rummaged and mumbled his way through the boxes. As Jane walked in the door with their coffees, Mark gave a yelp of delight, clutching a most insignificant small box. "This should do it. It's worked before on one of my projects," he exclaimed. "You know what I'm going to do, don't you?" "Yep. You're going to use that gadget in your hand to run the EEG data stream slower so that the video picture on the screen runs slower and clearer," she answered intuitively. "You're not just a pretty face, are you?" "No." At 8 minutes to 1 in the morning, he was ready again, with Jane fast nodding off. Mark started the sequence once again, and the result was startling. Trees, what looked like buildings of some sort, and a jiggling frame affair all jumped around the screen. He slowed the stream some more. He was actually witnessing something no one on Earth, to his knowledge, had ever seen before. It seemed to be his patient's memory of a train journey. Mark carefully switched off the equipment as he felt tiredness overwhelm him. He shook poor Jane awake, and together they headed for a well-earned sleep. He would wait until the morning to tell Jane the incredible news, and just before he fell asleep, he thought of the miles of data yet to run. The next day, Jane had the morning off duty, so Mark didn't wake her, but he did leave her a note to say that he had seen some pictures which he could hardly believe were there before his eyes. That evening they began again, trying to scrutinize every scrap of information they saw. When Jane first saw the images, she looked over to Mark's excited face with a blank look on hers, but was soon convinced when he slowed the stream a bit more. They noted down all they saw, even descriptions of any images that weren't clear and didn't make sense. "This is incredible, but we must keep it to ourselves. It seems from the witness that the car was deliberately trying to run him down. Attempted murder, no less," said Mark, full to the brim with enthusiasm. "We must run through all the data to see if he remembers that. But that could take weeks or even months at this rate. We can't spend all our spare time staring at that screen." "Be realistic, Mark," she said irritably. "I know it's fantastic and all that, but we can't leave it at that. This work could already make you famous." Mark was pacing. "But don't you see? We might discover why he was run down. It must be all there in his head. We've just got to hope that he recalled it. That is, if he remembers it. We must find out," stated Mark emphatically. Hours of data runs seemed to repeat the same sort of images of movement seen through a train window. They were sure it must have been a train and not a car, because no road scenes appeared, no other cars or lorries, just trees, poles, and buildings. Thinking about what things one would see on a train journey convinced them that the images of some clearer buildings were in fact stations where the train had stopped, with fast-moving blobs eclipsing the window view as passengers alighted onto the platform. Slowing the data stream of the journey even more didn't help at all. Just fuzzy gray blocks with no detail, just as it would have appeared to him through the window. Why do you think there's so much remembered about a train journey? Unless it was a very long journey. Mark shook his head, puzzled. "That's it," Jane said wide-eyed. "That's what?" "It probably was a long train journey, and this particular dream recording was his mind trying to relive it. It could infer that it was very important to him, and that's why he dwelt on it so long. It might not even have been a long trip, but just that his mind kept going over and over the same shorter journey, though it's hard to tell," expounded Jane. "Ah, but there wasn't all that much repetition of individual images of the stations, if they were stations. They all appeared a bit different. I put my money on it being a long journey," he said, looking as if he was glad he'd come to some conclusion after hours of boring viewing. The data they had run through had been just one REM sleep dream sequence. There were dozens more. The novelty had worn off, and the lack of detail made it seem hardly worthwhile carrying on. Nevertheless, they did spend the next 3 evenings and a whole coinciding day off plodding relentlessly through the next batch of indistinct images. It paid off. Toward the middle of the third run, a mix of unintelligible images suddenly changed, as if the patient had jolted his mind to think of something different. Although the scenes were equally unclear, what this dream showed was very mystifying. Mark and Jane gathered up any enthusiasm they had left and watched a darkened screen with a brighter area jumping around in the middle. What could it be? They watched the images appear for a few minutes, and then they changed again as suddenly as before. This time, they were witnessing a clear picture of people, lots of people, apparently moving backwards and forwards around the man's field of vision in his mind's eye. It was infuriatingly impossible to make out any facial details, but people they certainly were, the first images which were revealing the undeniable vision of recognizable objects. This improvement in clarity spurred Mark on to thinking if it was possible to further improve the quality of the images. His equipment wouldn't improve them because that was how they appeared to the victim in his jumbled mind. After all, he was being kept alive by the machines he was plugged into. It was amazing he was able to think or dream anything. Mark discovered that an old college friend of his was working in the pharmaceutical research department on the far side of the site, and they met now and again to discuss each other's work. He only told Pete Glendon about the general work he had undertaken in neurology, much of it to do with some of the other patients he was monitoring, with little mention of the unknown man. Pete was employed by the MRC to research into various drugs which could prove useful for the treatment of patients. At the moment, he was working on a drug complex which could be used to heighten a patient's morale, one which affected the part of the brain responsible for alertness to artificially block feelings of despondency and apathy, whilst at the same time stimulating the senses. It was a common condition in long-term patients who gradually become lethargic and torpid. Mark was interested in this type of drug being available for those suffering from brain damage in the hope that stimulation may bring about brain cell regrowth and reorganization, which might carry on naturally in the brain when the drug was withdrawn. It was one of the many things he and Charleston discussed at their once-a-week meetings. Pure electrical treatment was also a relevant area for discussion, being used by doctors in cases of deep depression, although it was being phased out in recent years partly for ethical reasons. This drug, in one form, had already gone through clinical trials and was beginning to be used for those patients who would most benefit, particularly those who were inclined to have thoughts of suicide. The version Pete was presently involved with was essentially the same chemical complex, but had another chemical group attached to the original molecule, which it was hoped would further enhance the beneficial qualities of the drug and reduce some of the inevitable side effects, one of which was loss of appetite. At his next meeting with Dr. Charleston, Mark suggested a series of trials of the drug on his patient, as the results may well prove interesting at the very least. Much to Mark's surprise, he agreed, as the man's state was considered hopeless anyway. Anything which may result in the patient's recovery to any degree would be appropriate, he said, and since the drug was already being introduced in other areas of medicine, he could see no reason against its use. Mark's chemist friend supplied him with the latest drug complex, the so far untested improved version. He had not told Pete exactly why he wanted a drug, only that it would be a good opportunity to try it out. This could be the key to enhancing his patient's memory and the clarity of the recorded images. The final go-ahead to use the drug was given by Dr. Charleston's superior. The next day this was done intravenously. Mark's plan was taking shape, although Jane had gross misgivings about the whole thing. It appeared to her that things were turning in a sinister direction, and that Mark had become unreasonably obsessed. As she pointed out to him, his great discovery, obtained only by modification of the existing monitoring system, was virtually above board, although he should, strictly speaking, have told Charleston of his plans. But he now stood a good chance of ruining his career and his good name as well as putting his golden discovery in the shade. That is, if he chose to reveal it at all.